Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar series for the August audition. And we have Roshan back here again with the topic Professional Adulting and Thriving in Your Career from Day One. So without further ado, I'll pass the time to Roshan and he'll take you away.
All right, thank you very much, Andrea. And it's I think we've got probably about another 30 seconds or so. So while we are waiting for a couple more folks to join in, what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through a number of quick things. Andrea, you want to just quickly walk through logistics?
Yep, sure. All right. So for this session, it will be a 60-minute session. We will have a quick opening, which is now. I'm going to explain a bit about how to use the platform if you're new here. And then Roshan will take us away with a 45-minute sharing session on today's topic. And then we will have a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, so go ahead and put it on the Q&A tab or even in your chat, and Roshan will answer accordingly. All right, so you can post your question in the Q&A tab, like I mentioned, or the chat, and I will help you with that. And this is how you will do it. Go ahead also to the public chat to share your opinions, whether you agree with what Roshan is saying about adulting or not. If you feel like you have a different mindset altogether, feel free to challenge him. He loves challenges and questions, so go ahead and do that. All right, so I think that's about it, and we're back to you.
Okay. All right, thanks very much. And so today one of the things I wanted to talk a little bit about is the word professional adulting sounds very queer to me, but I guess it's one of those terms where we talk about, as we get into adulthood, one of the things I think that is fundamental for each and every one of us is how do we thrive in our careers. And so maybe, I'm going to start a little bit by talking about my own life a little bit, and then we'll go into a session where, I'll take some of your questions. Feel free anytime to ask questions, and we can go from there. But let me just walk you through a little bit of my life and some of the lessons I've learned along the way. And I think some of this may be applicable. So I've had, about 12 plus 13 jobs. I don't record my early jobs when I was in college, where I worked at ExxonMobil and a number of other establishments and internships and so on and so forth. But my first real job started with General Electric. And when I started with GE, I had a very interesting boss. My boss was a very tough, rough guy who was always demanding excellence. And one of the things I learned, and this guy's name was Mike Petrucelli, one of the things I learned significantly from Mike was that, at the end of the day, right, the most important thing that you can bring to the table is your outcome, is the product, is the performance. And early on in life, I was kind of established that performance matters. Everything at the end of the day, no matter how hard you tried, no matter what you did and how you did it and so on and so forth, at the end of the day, if you can produce performance, right, you will be fine and you will do all right. And so, it started with that mindset, that performance is key. And I've had a number of roles. I worked, in mostly in the finance function. I worked a little bit in the supply chain in Europe. So in G Capital, and Europe, I basically ran the supply chain for a European organization for GE, a banking infrastructure, which is called G Capital. I came back to the US in my sixth role, and while prior to my role in Europe, I actually worked at a TV station, NBC, also in a finance role. But I came back to the US. Back to the US for my sixth role to be in a technology role. So I was the head of Y2K, which was interesting problem that we had in the world at that point in time. The year 2000 was dawning on us, and we had some systems that were not ready and not prepared to be able to adapt to the whole transition into year 2000. And so I took on that role, and so it's a very different role from being in finance or in supply chain. Understanding the technology space and understanding how to create infrastructure and transition this whole solve this problem of the Y2K problem. But then and then I came back to Asia for my seventh role, where I ended up running a business. So I ran the GE aviation business and grew that. We almost 5 times the business. And then I took a couple of cross-functional roles. I went to HR, the HR space for my next 2 roles. Then I worked at Johnson & Johnson, also in the global talent space. And then ultimately I came back and started Leaderonomics. So that's a little bit of my career. But I think I want to, and feel free at any point in time to shoot questions or that you have. But I wanted to give you a sense of what I've done. It's not very atypical, because many times I think you see people in jobs, they tend to either stay in a certain function or stay in a certain organizer. I stayed in GE for 14 years, but throughout that 14 years with 9 different jobs, very, very diverse and very, very multifunctional to some extent. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but that just to give you a sense of my own career. Now, I want to ask a question for each and every one of you, and I think something that you have to think for yourself is, at different parts of your life, right, you will be doing different things, and each thing requires a very different learning ability or learning capacity, right? So when you start out, right, if you look at my first job, right, my first job was really about how do I manage myself, because I was an individual contributor. I worked as an analyst, working for the CFO of the company at that point in time, and my job was to enable him to execute his job, enable him to make decisions on the funds that we invested in, enable him to make kind of good decisions on a number of things. So as an individual contributor, when we look at what we are doing as an individual contributor, you really have to manage yourself really well, and a lot of things is very technical, because you need to be, say, if you're in a finance function, or if you're in a HR function, or if you're in a marketing function, depending on what function you are, the technical expertise is going to be very important. How we go deep in the technical space is going to be critical for your success. And I found that very true. So the deeper, as I was an individual contributor, being in the finance function, I needed to be very deep in the finance space. And the deeper I get into the finance space, the more appreciated. Now, the other couple of things, managing self is, one is the technical ability, but there's other things, and one is managing deadlines, because always, bosses always want you to achieve deadlines, and the deadline was yesterday, right? The deadline is never, 1 year from now, I need you to produce these things. It's although it's now or yesterday or, tomorrow, can you give this to me, right? But how do you manage that? So it's not so much about pushback, but how do you automate yourself so that you can produce more? So it's going to be about productivity. It's going to be about efficiency. And then the other piece, right, is reliability. How reliable are you, right? And bosses want their employees to be super reliable, because if the more reliable you are, the more work you get, right? But what happens is that your standing in that organization starts to increase exponentially the more reliable you are. And remember, bosses are always dependent on a few people, that they are highly reliable on. And these people ultimately are the folks that ultimately will succeed, or will get promoted to some extent. Now, the last point I thought very important for myself was quality, right? So you can do things fast, you can be reliable, but what differentiates you is quality. And when you put all these things together, right, the next piece comes how you give, right? So giving is going to be a big part of how you get ahead. So I'll give you a quick story of myself at this point in time. So I remember I'll go back to my previous slide, and I'll talk a little bit about this time of mine when I was in my first job, and then I moved to my second job. So when I moved to my second job, so I was an analyst here. I moved to my second job, and my second job was essentially in a town called Dallas, right? So I was in a company called G International. Sorry, my third job. I'm talking about my third job. So I moved from my second job. I was an analyst in my first job, and my second job, I went to a town called Shelton, and I was kind of another analyst again for another CFO at that point in time. So here am I in my second job, and it happened to be, this job was a bunch of accountants. So I happened to be an analyst, and then there was about 40 or 50 accountants in this job. And so these accountants are very technical people, and they're all in their 40s or 30s, right? So they're very technical, and somebody does the US GAAP, they know GAAP number 8, GAAP number 10, and they go very deep, imputed interest, they go very deep in their space. And I'm kind of the consolidator. Once they all did the accounting, I would consolidate everything, and I want my boss to do some analysis, and then we present it to the business leaders, right? So that was kind of my role. So one day, my boss, and very interestingly, my boss had this perspective, to him, reliability was this, right? So to my boss, reliability was very simple. If you stay back late, that means you're reliable, right? So for him, reliability was this. People who go home early are useless. So this is an old traditional boss. Now, one day I used to come in, and one of the things I said is I want to do things very fast. So I used to figure out, how do I get productive, right? How do I do? So the moment I came in, I started to automate a lot of things that I did. So I realized that, again, this was 1994, right? 1995, right? So things were very, computers were just about coming in to the workplace. Email was just coming in. So there was very little automation, and I started using Lotus 123, or today you call it Excel, and we started to automate a lot of things. Now, as I started to automate these things, I realized that, I come into work at 8 a.m. in the morning. By about 10 or 11 o'clock, I'm done, right? And I, because I automated the process of collecting information, then I just needed 2-3 hours to do analysis, and then I could churn out analysis and show it to my boss. But my boss wanted me to stay there late, because if not, he considered you not reliable. So between 10, 11 o'clock in the morning to about 8, 9 o'clock at night when he goes home, I needed to find something to do. So I started to learn stuff. I started to say, how do I improve the quality of what I do? So how can I automate even more? How can I figure out how to, make it so, a year and month end when we do the closing will happen automatically. And I still started learning macros. I started learning programming. I started learning SQL, which is a programming language for Excel at that point in time. And I started to do all these things. And I realized that after a while, I'm bored, right? So I then decided to say, how can I help others, right? And so I went to an accountant and said, hey, accountant, what do you do? Oh, I do imputed interest. What do you do? Oh, here's how we calculate. Wow. And he said, and I'm very tired because it takes me a long time. So I said, let me help you automate your process. So I help him automate some of the processes. And then suddenly his job moved from a very complex job to a very simple job. And then I went to another guy and automated, and I automated, and I automated. And as I kept automating, right, what happened is, at some point in time, every single person would share with me what they do. And I started becoming very technical. I started becoming very clever in understanding different aspects of finance, because all these accountants, they would have to explain their whole job. And I had to then go very deep into understanding each part of their job and being able to automate that role. And one day my boss said, hey, I got promoted. I'm moving over to another organization, another GE company. And I said goodbye to him. And at that time, the CEO of the company, went to talk to the head of accounting, a guy called Pedro, and said, Pedro, we would like to promote you to become the new CFO. And Pedro was very strange. Pedro said, look, I don't know. I don't think I want to be CFO, and I don't have any interest to be CFO. But you know who should be the CFO? It should be Roshan, because he knows everything. Then the CEO came and talked to me. And it's like, they all want you to be the CFO. What's the story? Then I said, I don't know. I just help them to automate all these things. And do you understand this? Do you understand it? I say, yeah, I understand, because I help them to automate. And, I kind of was made the acting CFO, even though I was the youngest person in that team at that point in time. But that ability to be technical, to be able to be reliable, to go deep and have quality, and to give, right? When you keep giving, right, what happens is then the organization starts giving you. And so then I suddenly got a big jump, right? I moved from an analyst to become not a department head, but essentially to become, the CFO of an organization. And when you have that kind of jump, right, your career starts to have huge jumps, right? So straight away, you're now a CFO of a business unit. Essentially the next job you're going to go is you're going to jump to a bigger job and a bigger job and a bigger job. So I think, one lesson I learned is that if you can manage yourself really well, you set yourself up to be able to manage others and become a manager and so on and so forth, right? So as you look at your own life, right, you say, are you at a managing self level? And if you are, that's great, but make sure you start going deep in that space and being really good. And I think these three things, technical, deadlines, reliability, and quality, becomes very important. Now, the other piece is, how do you manage? As you go on in your career, you will go to a point where I'm managing others, right? And then it's a different sort of things that is required, right? When you manage others, right? And so, I failed miserably as a first-time manager because, it was not about doing work very well, which is what I did really well. I can do my own work very well. But when you become a manager of others, it's more about planning. It's about making others execute well. It's about coaching. It's about getting results, not through your efforts, but through the efforts of others, right? So this is not easy, right? Because it completely changes what you used to do into something very different. And I struggled. For years and years, I struggled. How do you manage others? And when you manage managers, right, as you go on in your career, you reach a point where, hey, today I'm not just managing others, I'm managing managers. Now, what does managing managers mean? Means that you are managing a group, a person who actually manages a group. So you manage this group, you manage another a manager who manages another group, you manage a manager who manages another group. And so now your job is very different. Now it's about setting agendas. It's about how do you enable this person to enable them to get results, right? It's about delegation and mentoring and so on. And then you become a functional manager. So now you manage a person who's managing many groups. And then you become a business manager. Then it becomes about strategy, it's about process, it's about communication. Because remember, now you're far removed from the organization, right? You have this level, you have multiple levels, right? There's many levels started to creep in, right? And as you have more and more levels, right, the complication, the alignment, the communication breakdowns become more and more evident. And then you become a business manager and a group manager, and ultimately you become an enterprise manager, where now you're managing a company with shareholders. It's about vision, it's about institution building, and each of it is a process, So if you start looking at yourself, so that's why I asked you the question, where are you, right? Because if you are at a point in your career and you say, hey, in my own career, I'm here, but I have not developed these things, or I'm here, I'm already at managing a manager, but I have not developed this part of my life, I've not developed this part, you're going to struggle in this part, and you won't be very effective. And you'll say, oh, at some point in time, you sort of stall, and you end up, stuck here. And this is called the middle manager trap, right? You cannot move on because you don't have this, you didn't build the foundations required to go to the next phase. Or you go to the next phase because you didn't build the foundation here and here, you worked here a short time, you are not able to truly be impactful and to be able to do your job well. So, a note of caution to everyone, right? I know a lot of people say a career is it's a quick race. I want to get to enterprise manager. I want to be the CEO as fast as I can. But if you get to this point without actually developing each of these pieces, right, what happens is you become a very poor leader. And this is a big issue down the road for many leaders, right? They struggle because they have not actually put in enough effort to go in to really develop themselves at each level of their development process. So that's a quick question to each and every one of you. Where are you in your career? Now, another thing I want to share very briefly, and then I'll go a little bit more deeper into some other lessons that I've learned, is that if you look at your career cycle, and I think not many people talk about career as a cycle, right? So why I say it's cycle is because when you have stages, right? So that my earlier slide I talked about stages, right? So the previous stage was manage self, manage others, manage manager, and so on and so forth. But at this stage, right, it's what sort of each stage you go through this process of self-awareness. Now there's two pieces to self-awareness. One is how are you creating value, right, for the company, and how are you creating value for yourself, and are you aware of where you are? Now when you have a reality check and you understand where you are, then you start to say, okay, based on where I am, what sort of direction do I need to make, and what sort of things do I need to learn, and what sort of plan do I need to have? And then I start to make these plans happen, and then the plans work, and then you start to say, okay, I'm in a new phase now. What sort of value am I creating for the company? What sort of value do I need to create for myself? And then, what should I take? So what direction should I take? And then what plans should I have? And how do I make these plans happen? And if you keep doing this over and over in a reiterative manner, right, at some point in time, you'll be very successful. Now, what people tend to forget, right, and I feel this is a very important lesson that I've learned, is that many times when we look at careers, we only think about this: what can I do for myself, right? So a lot of people go into organizations and say, I'm not happy with this organization. Why? Because they're not giving me enough. I'm not learning. I'm not challenged. I'm not. So then the question I always ask is, what have you done for the company that the company will invest in you, right? Because if you are not giving and making the company grow better, impact its customers better, drive productivity, cost savings, speed, get things done faster, impacting the community that the company. If you are not creating value for the company is going to create value for you. And this is a big lesson that I learned. That the more value you create for the company, the more value the company creates for you. I'll just give you an example. I was a company called General Electric, right? So everybody say, oh, GE is very great. But I realized the better GE fared, right, When GE in the 1990s, right? When I was in the early to mid 90s, I was in GE. So I spent 14 years up to the year 2007 or so in GE. And during those years in GE, one of the things I learned is that as GE did well, right? Guess what? More and more people wanted to hire me, right? And the more value we created in the company, and the more high profile the company became, the more high profile I became. So I give you a quick example. So I was in Barcelona. I told you I was heading up Y2K in one of my roles, right? So I went to Barcelona, and we have a power business there, and we were having a kind of a supplier gathering where we brought all our suppliers and say, are you Y2K compliant? Our suppliers ready to provide us with all our ensure our supply chain was effective during Y2K. So we're having a supplier summit, and so these are our customers, our suppliers essentially. And I was speaking there, and I was explaining, what we need to do. And remember, I'm not a tech guy, right? So I explained in a very simple, easy manner, what we need to do. And then, at the end, so these were CEOs of our suppliers. At the end, a CEO came to me and said, hey, I'd like to buy you dinner tonight. And I said, okay, sure. Happy to have dinner with you. And so, I went off for dinner with this guy, and it's a big company. It's a huge company. It's a huge power company. And he said, I really need a CIO, Chief IT Officer. I was listening to you, and I would like to make an offer to you to come to Barcelona and be our CIO. And I looked at him, and I wanted to laugh, firstly because me, CIO, he doesn't even know my background, right? But then I started to realize that the reason I'm getting this job offer is because of GE. It's because of the fact that GE is such a well-respected company in the 90s, and Jack Welch was such a well-respected CEO. And the more value I added to GE, and the more, you go back to the previous chart, right, which I said, the more ability I had to show my technical skills and reliability and the quality and how we are able to muster this big organization together to achieve all the things that we're trying to achieve. The more I did that well, the more people will come to you and say, you will see career growth simply as a result of you adding value. So the more value you add to the company, the more you see your career grow. And that was something, relatively interesting that I found. And I want to just share one more test. I think that's interesting is what I call the self-awareness test. So, I always say, it starts with this. What's your career inventory? And the career inventory is, what have you done? What have I done? What value have I added into the company? Right. So I did this, I helped this, I told you my second job, right? One of the things I started to do was to provide automation. Nobody asked me to do it, right? I provided automation to the accountants because I thought that by doing that, I could learn about accounting because I was an analyst and I wanted to understand accounting. I wanted to understand the US gaps. I wanted to understand how we applied rules like that in finance and so on. But to me, I was requiring, but because I did that, I was able to understand everything, and I was able to automate so many things, and I was able to build friendships with so many people, and I was able to build trust. So they say, this guy, he just wants to help us, and he's using his own time. They didn't know, obviously, I had automated my entire work, and my work took me 2-3 hours a day. I had so much free time. But because of this, right, I made a lot of accomplishments. So every job, the one thing I start to do is, hey, what are things I need to accomplish? But then I also ask the question, what are experiences I need? And this may be projects, and later I'll explain a little bit about careers, right? Careers are not linear. Linear means it's not straight. I must learn this, I must learn this, I must learn this. Career, as Steve Jobs once said, careers are actually many dots. You need to get many dots. And only later you're able to connect all these dots, and they all make sense. Prior to that, there's no logic. But your job is to get as many dots as possible in many diverse areas. So I say, what are experiences that I need? And then you say, where do I want to go? As a target, right? So when you understand what you have done and where you want to go, then you start to say, what are the experiences that I need, right? And you can sort of say, these are my accomplishments, these are my frequently applied skills that I use all the time, these are my values, and this is my career requirements, this is where I want to go, right? And when you start mapping, this is a simple self-awareness tool that each and every one of you can use. And later I will share the slides, and you can you can leverage the slides in our handout section at the end of the session. I will make that available to everyone. So this is something that each and every one of you can really take and say, how can I use this for my own ability, for my own planning, and sometimes when you start a new job, ask yourself, what have I done, where do I want to go? And these are some things that you can ask yourself. So again, this is a little tool that you can use, right? Now I want to share a little process that I was taught, right? So when I joined GE in 94, I went through an orientation, and one of the things they told me, right, they said that, look, your career has this thing called pie. And I'm not sure, has any of you heard of this thing called pie? P-I-E. If you have, just say yes in the chat, right? Have you heard of pie, right? So this is a tool that many people use for managing your career. And I'm going to share this. If you have, just go to the chat and type, yes, I've heard of pie, or no, I've not heard of pie. What are you making me eat now? What the hell is wrong with you guys? I thought it's a webinar, not food. But okay, so no one seemed to have, nobody. So, okay, I get a lot of what's a pie. All right, fantastic. Okay, so let me then walk you through what a pie is. Pie is actually 3 aspects of managing your career that I was taught very early on to take note of. And I think I spoke about one piece of it. So pie is actually 3 parts, right? The first part of pie is this, how do you drive performance? Right? So performance is the key part, right? And in when I was taught this, I said, look, performance is the entry ticket. If you have no performance, you don't even talk, right? There is no point talking and saying, can you give me a full-time job? I'm an intern, but you don't have performance, forget it. You won't even get enter. You won't even have the entrance ticket. Not me talking about promotion. You won't even have the entrance into the. So performance is number 1. The second part is image. What sort of image do you carry? What sort of image do you stand for? What sort of message? The way you act, the way you walk, the way you talk, the way you dress, the way you talk, the messages you send with your body language, right? And the image you send, where it's a thing. And today, right? I mean, back in my time, they look at resumes, but today, when you look at LinkedIn, right? When you look at Facebook, recruiters are sort of saying, here, let's check this guy out. And they're going to your Facebook profile, they're going into LinkedIn, you're going to say, who's this guy? Who's this girl? Is it worth looking at that? So your track record, your potential, what do people talk about you, right? I mean, that's all image, right? So you got performance, you got image. And the last part is exposure. And this one is important, right? What sort of exposure do you have? And do you have only exposure to your areas that you know of? So let's say you studied accounting and you only have exposure to accounting. You're not very valuable to the organization. Now, if you have exposure to accounting because you studied that, but you also have done some side projects on blockchain, and you've done some side projects on a startup, and you've done some community work, and you've done some volunteer work in NGOs and this and that, and suddenly your exposure seems to be a lot more wider. Now, hey, this is an interesting profile, because this person not only understands the accounting, which is a given, but also has multifaceted sort of capability and capacity. And that's very interesting. And it's not just about internal. So many people, they work in. I remember, again, I'm a long time guy in GE, right? So I spent 14 years working in GE before Johnson & Johnson came and headhunted me and pulled me into a global role for them. But why I got that global role with Johnson & Johnson is because of the fact that I had, in as far as people are concerned, they said, look, this guy had performance in GE, obviously, because they kept promoting him. You look at his image. I mean, he's speaking in conferences. He's known, in sort of his space. But at the same time, hey, he's not a HR guy. He's a finance guy. He's a supply chain guy. He's got technology. And wow, this seems like a very interesting profile for us to bring to Johnson & Johnson, and likewise to other organizations, right? If I so wanted to work in other companies, right? So these are the I'm going to jump in a little bit on performance and image, and exposure. I think is something I will talk a little bit about in the next phase when I go into some lessons learned. Okay, so I'm going to spend a bit more time figure out this. Now, the idea, right, of performance is to maximize results. Remember, I said that output is key. No matter what, at the end of the day, it's going to be your output, right? But image is all about how do we develop presence, how do we develop influence. And a lot of it, remember I told you about my story about how I gave, and by giving, right, I developed influence, because now they say, oh, this guy knows everything about accounting because he's helped Pedro, he's helped this guy, he's helped Jeff, he's helped, a whole bunch of people to develop their automation of accounting processes. That means he knows accounting inside out, right? And that influence, right, happens by the image you portray. So I'm the image of giving, the image of always wanting to help, the image of whenever there's trouble, I'm the first one to say, okay, come on, let me jump into it. Not counting the costs. And what you do in terms of the early part where you're managing self, right, is going to be critical, right? Okay, so that's Pi, and hopefully Pi helps you as you think about your own life and saying, what's my performance? What's my image? What's kind of the exposure that I'm looking for, right? Now I want to talk about performance, right? So to me, a performance is about this. Number one is every job you get into, no matter how much you hate the job, right? No matter how much you love the job. I was lucky or unlucky, I guess. I got promoted after my that job, and I went to NBC, right? A couple of jobs later, I can't remember, my fourth job, I think. So I went to NBC. And at that time, I was already quite an acting CEO, CFO, and I was I went to Dallas and I was the head of integration. So I had two big jobs, right? I was acting CFO. My second job, I was integration, heading up integration of three entities that GE bought together. So I thought, okay, when I go to NBC, I'm gonna demand. I mean, I'm sure it's gonna be a big job. But when I went to NBC, because I was a GE person seconded into NBC, which is a TV media company, they don't like GE people because GE people are manufacturing and financial services, and we are creative, we are NBC. And so I got dumped. I'm a finance guy. They dumped me, and my CFO, at that point in time, couldn't be bothered about me. And I really was upset, and I want to quit. And I talked to my mentors. I talked to my first boss, Mike, who at that time was heading up a big mutual fund in Boston. So I said, hey, Mike, and Mike said, look, Roshan, I will hire you. But he told me something very interesting. He said, look, I don't mind hiring you, but when you leave your job, right, you never leave a job at the bottom where they're happy that you get out the door. You leave the job, when you want to leave a company, you leave the company at the top where they will try their best to want to keep you, and they will die when they're going to lose you. And you say, wow, if you can do that, right? If you can be able to leave a company and the company really, really wants you, right, with all their heart, wow, that and how you do that is no matter how trivial, no matter how shitty, no matter how lousy the job is, you make a difference in that job. That means you do it outstanding. And then I said, Mike, but they gave me this account reconciliation job, which is horrendous. It's like the lowest of the food chain in finance, right? Then he said, yeah, then you do a really good job in accounts reconciliation. And so I started to do that. I said, okay, I account reconciliations, for those of you in finance, you understand that it's a very manual, very tedious job where you have to reconcile accounts. And so I started reconciling. And most of the time, when you reach, you have a $50 or $100 is off, you kind of just what we call rounding error, or you kind of just delete it and put it on suspend, or you kind of just kind of reclassify it, right? But I had one account where it was off by a few hundred, and I'm like, no, I'm not going to delete it. I'm going to make sure it reconciles to zero. That means both the balances on the balance sheet would be zero. And so I started reconciling. And as I started reconciling, I realized that over the years, we have just rounded it up, and we've we've kind of thrown away $1,000 here, $5,000 there. We've kind of kept rounding 10,000, 5,000. Every month there was always a rounding error. And so I say, wait, let me go back and clean this up. The more I cleaned it up, the bigger the reconciliation happened. So instead of being off by a few thousand, it became off by 1 million. That be off by 2 million, off by 5 million, off by 7. After a while, it became off by 7 million. And I'm like, oh my goodness, why did this happen? And I got really confused. Now, the other thing I was doing is that, remember exposure, right? I talked about E, right? So one of the things I realized early is that I needed exposure. Whenever I went into a new job, I wanted exposure with all the leaders. So I used to send an email to all the leaders in NBC when I came in. I said, dear CEO, dear CFO, dear Chief Marketing Officer, dear BD person, dear head of this division, can you, I'm new in this company, I'd like to get you, I'd like to have a mentoring session with you so that I can learn from you. I'm happy to buy you lunch. Would you be able to be available for a quick catch up so I can learn from you? And when I sent this message, every single one of them said, okay, I'm happy to meet up with you, except the CEO. His secretary manages his email at that time. And so she never really bothered to reply to it. And he did finally, about 3 or 4 months later, he replied, and I replied. He says too busy and I won't be able to make it. But everybody else, I started to have lunch. So it just happened where one day I was having lunch with the CFO. So he took me out as a mentoring and said, "Hey, okay." And this is the global CFO of the whole MBC, right? The whole business. And so I was having lunch with him, and he said, "Hey, what are you working on?" He says, "Oh, I'm doing, I do want to say I'm doing account reconciliation. So I'm saying I'm doing, some work on MSNBC, which was the reconciliation I'm working. MSNBC is a joint venture that Microsoft and NBC had at that time." And so he said, "Oh, what are you?" So then he said, "Did you know I was CFO of MSNBC before?" Then I said, "Oh, really?" Then he said, "I have a problem. I'm trying to reconcile something, and I just can't seem to understand why. And I'm off." Then he said, "Okay, bring your folder over to my office and let's talk." So I brought over this big folder and I showed him some of the stuff, and he says, "Interesting," because I had actually done a lot of work. I had pulled out every single invoice. I pulled out all the expenses over the last 7 years for 5 or 6, I can't remember how many years for MSNBC. And he started looking and saying, "Hey, Roshan, these are startup costs, I said, "What do you mean?" "These costs should actually be split between Microsoft and NBC. Why is it on NBC's books? It should be paid off already, and it shouldn't be on our books." I said, "Okay, so what should we do? Let's go visit Microsoft." So he said, "Join me." So we flew out and we went to Seattle and we met the Microsoft guys and we talked about the JV. And at the end of it, the Microsoft guys agreed to pay $3.5 million cash to NBC because it's their portion of the business. And we show them all the costs, right? And at the and on the flight back, right, he was telling me, he's like, "Hey, Roshan, I've got a new division, this small division that we have, news, that I'm looking for kind of a finance lead for this piece. Would you be interested in becoming the finance lead?" And obviously I'm like, "Yeah, sure." And what happened was that because you did a great job in a lousy job, you made a difference. People noticed it. You started to develop a reputation, and then you get the promotion. You don't have to even look for the next job. The job will come to you, right? So that one I learned, at NBC, is that, when, and I am very thankful to my boss, Mike, for giving me that advice to stay on in NBC. And when I left NBC and we did a turnaround of NBC News after that, you left as a superstar. You didn't leave as a angry at NBC and upset. You left as a person that NBC didn't want to lose you. And I also didn't want, but I mean, obviously GE said, "No, we want to send you to London." And I thought London was more appealing than New York at that point in time. So I jumped in. Now, the other piece of advice I want to leave with you is this, right? Part of performance is to take on the hardest job. That's going to be really, really hard. And this is another piece of advice my boss said: take the hardest job. So I remember when I finished my first job with my boss, Mike, there's a number of options. And I ended up going international. And then after that, there a lot of, I was acting CFO. I get a lot of options, right? And one of the things I started to look at is I can do another one, which is in Connecticut, in New York, where I was. Or there was this job in Dallas to do integration, but it was a very tough job. It was in the oil and gas space, which I really didn't understand. And I looked at it and I listened. I remember what my boss said: take the hardest job. Take the job where you're going to fail, right? Because early on in your life, when you fail, it's okay. People forget about it. And so I took the job in Dallas and I failed miserably, right? And I think as punishment, they sent me to NBC, right? But that helped me to understand. And later when I went to UK, when we started to do the European integration and a lot of the stuff in Europe, that really helped me significantly on all the lessons that I learned in Dallas and why we failed in integration in Dallas, right? But I always encourage people, take on the hardest job and err on the side of the bigger challenge. The bigger challenge, even though it's harder, will always give. And if you succeed, right, the upside is going to be significant. Imagine if you fail, everybody expects you to fail. But if you succeed, then you are a superstar, right? Because everybody expected you to fail, right? And my last piece on performance is, you must have this drive to win. Right? When you do something, no matter how tedious or not nice this is, right? If you can have that ability, that urgency to get it done and done fast, right? Wow, I tell you, you will make a huge difference in terms of your own personal brand, in terms of your own personal exposure. So to me, I'm not going to talk so much about image, but I think a lot of times people forget about confidence. So I look at these 3 C's. Image is really about confidence. It's really about competence. How do you build that, and credibility? And this happens, it's this thing called time. Nobody can build competence and credibility instantly. You can say, I'm very confident, but no matter how confident you are, your competence and credibility has to take time. And this means learning, this means spending time, this means going deep. Sometimes it's not so nice to go deep in spaces that potentially going deep is always very painful, because you have to go and understand something deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And usually, if you want to learn something, you want to become expert. So, there's a difference between being a person who represents your school versus represents your country. Because the expertise level, or you become a Lee Chong Wei, who's number 2 in the world or number 1 in the world at some point in time, right? There's a huge gap difference, and that's what competence, credibility does to you, right? It takes time, right? And it takes a lot of effort, but don't compromise and say it's okay, because this is a journey, right? You want to try from day one, but you want to set yourself up, right? So it doesn't matter if you didn't succeed in day one, you want to succeed at the end of the day. And this is a long-term game that you're playing on, right? So the last one is exposure. I'll just talk very briefly about this. And this one is more of a quick test you can ask yourself. What's your personal brand equity? There's a quick evaluation, right? So, you ask yourself this question: I'm known for what? What am I known for? But by this time next year, I also want to be known for something else. Like today, I may be known for this, but 2 years from now, I want to be known for what? And when you understand that, go back to that inventory where I told you, right? If today you're known for this, but I want to be known for something else, then you can start saying, okay, what must I do, right? My current project is challenging me in what way? Okay, in this way, in that way. New stuff I've learned in the last 90 days includes that. If you cannot answer these, right, that means you're not learning. That means you're not growing. That means you're not really building your personal brand equity, right? My public, visibility program consists of what? That means, what are you doing? Are you going out there and, talking to students or volunteering? We have Leaderonomics Club that you can go and teach young kids, but what's your visibility program that you are personally doing, right? My resume, my CV is discernibly different this year or last year compared to this year. Because of what? In what way? In this way, I've taken on this internship, I've taken on this job, or I've volunteered here, or I've supported this NGO, and so on and so forth, right? So, as you start asking these questions, this again, my intent is not just to share my story, but also to give you some tools that you can use and questions that you can ask yourself and say, how can I improve, and how can I ensure I set myself up for success? Right. So I'm going to talk now in the next section. I'm going to share a little bit about some career lessons that I've learned along the way. And I think these will be helpful, in some way or some form to help you in your own personal career and your own personal journey, right? So one of the things I think I want to talk a little bit about is this whole aspects of leadership, right? And why is leadership so important? Because at the end of the day, leadership is important because companies will look to you to drive change. Remember, I talked about influence in a bit. The more influential you are, the more likely you can drive change. And the more you can drive change, the more successful you are. Great leaders drive change. And so companies put a premium on people who can drive change. So if you can drive change, you get premium. But if you can't drive change, you are not going to get that premium, right? And so one of the things you have to start understanding is our science of building leaders, right? And so we have another webinar. I did a whole webinar on the science of building leaders, so you can access more details on that. But when you start to look at them, you start to look at how have I developed my character? How have I developed my influence? How self-aware am I? How have I developed my intelligence and my capability? How have I developed my decision-making skills? My personal brand, my personal, and how have I used moments like crucible moments to help me create vision, to be able to be very clear about where I want to go and what I want to do and so on and so forth, right? And this is important because this enables, by developing your leadership capability, you are developing the ability to drive change. And why is change important, right? The reason why change is important is because most people hate change. So if people hate change and you embrace change and you can actually influence people not to hate change, but to actually love change, right? And embrace change, right? Not just love it, right? I embrace change. If you can enable people to do that, you're very valuable to the company in whatever role you do, whether you're HR, whether you're IT, whether you're supply chain, or whether you're finance, or whatever role. If you can enable people to embrace change, right, you become very, very useful to companies. And the problem is that, I told you the only person who likes change is the web baby. So how do you develop your personal leadership to enable you to be able to drive change, right? And I mean, the data tells you, right? I'll give you a quick quiz. You look at number 4. What percentage of people quit smoking after physical crisis? Something bad happens to you, and they say, okay, in 6 months' time, you're going to die of cancer. How many people actually quit smoking, right? You know what the percentage is? You can put on the chat if you can try and guess what the percentage is, right? Interestingly, you want to take a guess? I mean, what that percentage is? Interestingly, I've got not bad, Brian. 1%. Okay, I've got Brian at 40, but the answer is 43, right? Very close. But what does that mean? No, that means more than 50% of people would rather die, because if you don't quit smoking, you die, right? Would rather die than change, right? But it says it's not just across the board, right? Weight loss, obesity, companies, right? Fortune 500, more than 50%, 41%. So, at the end of the day, change is very hard. So if you, right, because people are fearful of change, right? It's very threatening. So if you, in your career, can find ways to learn how to drive change, to enable change, to empower people to love change in your team, to be the influencer, to enable them to pivot, to be able them to, accept that the world is changing, right? If you can do that, right, this is, to me, like one of the biggest career success determinants, right? So to me, right, I think that is one of the most amazing lessons that I've learned, right? Is the more times I have been able to influence and drive change, the more successful I've been. Because companies and organizations struggle with change, and it's always the number one issue is we need to change, but we are stuck in our old ways, right? And so to me, if you want to be successful, if you want to think of something, is be really good as a leader and understand how to influence, understand how to drive change. Wow, if you can do that, right? And how do you do that, right? You take on projects, right? You take on little projects. Maybe it's not projects in the company. Maybe you take on projects as a volunteer, for an NGO. And how do you drive change in the NGO? How do you drive change among volunteers to volunteer more? How do you drive change? And as you learn that, then you go to your company and say, hey, we need to pivot to this. How do we enable our employees to and you work with the business to say, I can help you with this project. And you take on these projects. And as you do that, right, the business will start to say, wow, this person can drive change. They definitely need to be in a bigger role. They definitely need to be promoted. They definitely need to be in roles where they can impact the organization in a bigger way. So that's my first lesson. Now, the second piece I want to share a little bit is accept that failure is a given. Now, it's interesting, right? You must and will fail, and it is a prerequisite for success. Now, many people think, failure. But let me explain something. I'm going to share with you some research by a guy called Dean Keith Simonton. Very, very famous researcher. You can Google this up, right? So he has 3 findings, which I found very interesting. The first finding is geniuses tend to hold a broad array of interests. So this is where I say, even though you may be in a job finance, but you need to find ways to be involved in supply chain and other areas in the company. Because, compared to their contemporaries, they dabble in unrelated field much more, right? And it may look as slacking off, I'm more interested in something else. But actually, they find these very unexpected connections between them. So this is number 1. That's not what I'm going to talk about. Now, I'm just going to share this, but I want to talk about the third piece. The second piece is geniuses receive only a moderate level of education. So compared to many people, right, we found that at least Simonton's research found that geniuses don't get a lot of education, nor they get too little, just moderate, right? So too much formal education or too little formal education, and they lack knowledge, right? And you're not credible. Oh, you mean you don't have a degree? I don't want to listen to you. So they don't get that level of respect. But too little classroom, too many classroom, and too much academics will end up being very stale. That's what happens in a lot of universities, right? The status quo. No, this we want to be peer reviewed rather than commercially reviewed, right? But the other thing that I found very interesting, this piece, geniuses actually don't offer better solutions. They offer more solutions, right? So you think about Picasso, you think about all these famous geniuses, they are remembered for a mere fraction of their work. They failed more times than they succeeded. And the sheer quantity, not quality, quantity of their work resulted in the quality. Now, what does that mean, right? So let me give you a simpler illustration, right? So let's take sports. This guy is Babe Ruth. I can show you a picture of Michael Jordan or David Beckham and all these guys. So if you look, Babe Ruth holds the record as the one player. So he's the guy, I mean, you all know him maybe as the guy who had the most home runs, who hit the most home runs, right, in the history of baseball. But he also holds another record. You know what's the other record he holds? The most number of misses, right? So he holds the record, the most number of hits, but he also holds the most number of misses, which means he actually attempted the most number of times. So the most number of times you attempt, the more likely you will have a record for the most number of hits, but you also have the most number of misses. Likewise, Michael Jordan, right? He says, I've missed more basketballs and I've had more misses than actually hits, right? And you see the same thing with David Beckham. You see the same thing with sports guys. They are known for two extremes. They are the guys who achieve great records, but they're also the guys who achieve embarrassing records as the most number of misses and most number of missed penalties and this and that and so on and so forth, because they attempt the most, right? And so what that starts to tell you is it goes back to the earlier research, right? Is that the more you do, right, the more likely you are to succeed, because quality is actually determined by quantity. The more quantity you produce, the more likely one or two of them will stand out, right? And you see this with writers. The more books you write, suddenly one book suddenly becomes a bestseller, right? And it's that quantity, together with that quality, right? But that means that, so reinforce back the message I say, it's a given. You're going to fail. So keep trying. So failure is not failing, failure is lack of trying, right? So we have to redefine failure as lack of trying, not as what we think it is, right? So I want to say, and many times, right, we play not to lose, and not play to win. Very different, If I play to win, I'm taking risks, I'm attacking, and maybe they will counter attack and I'll lose, right? But that's okay. I'm playing to win. Sometimes I lose, but I'm playing to win. But when you play not to lose, you're defending, and maybe you draw the game, but you're not playing to win. And ultimately, if you play not to lose too often, you will never succeed big in life. And the career is the same way, At some point in time, you have to take risks, you have to fail, you have to, but do that early part. Do that when you're on your own, your individual contributor. Fail as many times as possible. Take on the hard jobs. Mess up. That's fine. You can always get back on track. But if you mess up as a senior leader, that's it. Carla Fiorina with HP. You mess up, you're gone, right? I mean, you did the biggest acquisition in the history at that point in time, HP Compact acquisition, and then boom, you didn't succeed, right? Your career is gone. You can't lead anymore. Nobody wants to hire you, if that happens, right? And the last thing I want to add is this thing called learn, unlearn, and relearn. I talk a lot about this, right? I asked this question, how many of you like to learn? All of you say, I love to learn. But the reality is you're lying, right? Because learning is actually a process where you change something about yourself. Learning is actually change, right? Something about you changes. You change your mindset, you change your belief, you change your ability, you change your capability. Something changes in you. And that's what learning is. And that's why it's so hard. Because when you want to change something, it's not about listening. It's not about seeing. It's about doing. But it's also about teaching, right? I mean, when you do something and then you teach it, that's where you truly, truly learn. And that's why it's so, I listen and I forget. I see and I understand. I do and I can. I mean, there's Confucians who say that, right? But the other part of learning is self-confidence, right? And you can have knowledge, you have skill, but if you don't have the confidence, you cannot execute. And remember what I said at the start, if you cannot execute, you cannot perform, because performance is about execution, right? So how do you develop self-confidence? The only way you do self-confidence is by continuously doing. The more you do, the more you fail. After a while, you get a hang of it and you say, oh, I'm better at it. I'm good at it. And then you execute even better and you do it blindly. And this, I call this process unconscious unconscious competence, like is here, right? But you start where you're you're unconscious of your incompetence, right? So I don't know what I don't know. So a lot of young people, they think I know everything, right? But basically you don't know what you don't know, right? Which means that you're not conscious about how incompetent you are. But then you reach a point like, I'm conscious that I'm incompetent. That's where self-awareness, right? That's the first part of your career cycle I showed you just now, right? So when I'm conscious of my incompetence, I'm conscious I'm not so good at something, I take effort to learn it. And then I become consciously competent. I'm conscious that I'm quite okay at this now. I'm getting better at this. But you want to reach a point of unconscious competence. That means you can ask, and certain things I've reached this level where you can say, okay, let's do a presentation. Okay, fine. I'll just pull out a few things and then boom, I'm unconsciously competent. That means without me knowing it, I'm competent, right? And you want to reach the point where you can teach it. You're unconsciously teaching people competence. And not only am I unconsciously competent, I can confidently coach others to do it well. How when you reach this level, this is where you are full of confidence, and you're really learning. And goes back to this: you've learned, you've unlearned, and you've changed, or you've relearned. Whichever. Alvin Toffler calls it: the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. Right? And so, to me, take every opportunity to learn, right? I mean, there's many ways to do this, right? Now, the last part I want to talk about is the clarity of thinking. To be a clear thinker. I spelled thinking wrong. Okay, bad. Okay, bad. So, okay, never mind. So again, failure on my part. But okay, we will learn and we'll fix my spelling in the future. Okay, so never stop growing. Constant growth should be a constant in life, right? No, so clarity of thinking is really about this. You got to be able to sift through complex information and focus on key points. So to me, the better I became at clarity of thought, to be able to communicate clearly, to be able to translate strategy into clear, accountable objectives, to be decisive, to drive organic growth. The more I was able to do this well, the more successful I became. Because ultimately, this is one of the hardest skills to develop: clarity of thought. And the last part, is about growth. And I just want to share some slides and close this section out now. When we learn, right, this is a typical learning curve, right? You kind of initially you struggle, then over time, and then suddenly, you kind of grow. Now, the problem with growth is this. So when you first start a job, you struggle. And then as time goes on, you have this exponential leap. And then after that, you plateau. Now, the problem is that most companies have what we call an expectation bar, right? So there's a classic expectation bar. Now, most of the time, our first year, maybe we are here. Our second year, maybe we perform. Our third year, we're performing. Wow. So if you're doing here and your expectation is here, not so good. So year one, maybe not so good. Year two, wow, not bad. Okay, you meet expectation. Year three, wow, superstar. Okay. Now the problem is not that. No. The problem is that the next year, right? So let's say year one, year two, I'm here. Year three, I'm here. The problem is year one, you're here. Year two, you are here. But my year one, my expectation was here. My year two, my expectations are above. So you actually didn't meet. But my year three, I'm here. And maybe the year three expectation is here, right? In year three. So I did well for year three. Year four, I did all right. Year five, I sort of, year six, okay. But year seven, look, it's jumped up here already. So you see, what happens is expectation every year keep changing. I mean, this year I expect you to sell 10. Next year I expect you to sell 12, 15, 18, 20. You are improving. You're improving, right? The problem is at some point in time, you stop improving because you stop learning. The moment you are not struggling, that means you're not learning, right? So as far as the company is concerned, you are like that. Wow, at some point you were like a superstar, but now you're lousy, right? But you are saying, hey, wait. Last time, over here, I was selling 10. Over here, I was selling 12, 15, 18, 20, 21, 22, 23, 23, 23, 23, So even though I'm saying last time I said 23, I'm here, I'm selling 14, you say I'm very good. What's happening? I'm improving. But why you're saying I'm not improving? And why you saying I'm a non-performer? The problem is this, because at some point in time, expectations of the company, right, the results the company expected outweigh the result of what you were performing at. Because the following year, the bar will keep going higher, right? Every year, the bar keep going higher, but you're stuck. So how do you overcome this problem? The only way is for you, at some point in time, to make that leap. Make that leap, make that leap, make that leap, make that leap. And how do you make that leap? You make that leap by changing jobs, by doing something different, by forcing yourself to learn something new. And crisis, right, is very good because crisis force you to change your job faster, to change your role. So sometimes you're saying this role, but suddenly crisis creates a whole different pivot, right? And you have to learn and struggle again. So every time you learn and struggle, right? You want to be a superstar, you want to be CEO one day, right? You want to be middle manager? Okay, can. You just kind of every 5 years or 3 years, 5 years, you change job. But you want to be superstar, every 2, 3 years. And then as you go deeper into a job, you have to take more time because the seasons, the learning becomes even deeper and steeper. So you need more time, right? But for you to really grow, right, you need to check yourself every 2-3 years. Hey, am I growing? Is this job still giving me struggles? Because if you're not struggling, you're not learning. So I'm gonna close out with 1-2 questions. Are you people always ask, when should I change jobs, right? So I have a few questions I ask. Have you learned all there is to learn in your current role? Have you contributed as much as possible to your current? Have you performed your role better than your predecessor, the guy before you or the girl before you? Have you left a significant? If you can answer yes to all this, it's time for you to move to a new role. Okay, so that helps. I know there's always questions, right? So I want to end with this final sort of chart. So people always say these are, you do a good job and the company will take care of you. It's not what you know, but who you know that counts. Career planning is my manager's job. Nobody reads my performance appraisal anyway. If you only get ahead if you work in the hot area, or like IT or tech. I would rather be lucky than your initial job choice of your will. Just tell me the career path I need to be on. Just tell me. I'm too lazy to find out, right? So this is myths, right? Here's the reality. The reality is performance. Deliver exceptional performance. The reality is expertise. Become very deep and expert. The reality is ownership. Even though it's a lousy, shitty job, you take ownership. And you also have to take ownership of your learning. Whenever you reach a gap where you say, I'm not learning anymore, okay, then you got to take ownership to learn something else. And if you can't learn in the job, learn outside, right? It's about challenge and visibility. It's about building a network of mentors and supporters and role models. It's about getting cultural breadth, global experience, right? It's about all of these above, right? And the last part is about never stop learning and growing. If you can do all this, right, you will be very successful. So I leave you with 3 things. It's about getting as much experience. It's about getting as much feedback as possible. And it's continually developing your skill. I think if you can do these things, right, you will have a very successful career. So with that, I will leave you. We probably have about a minute or 2 to take a couple more questions. If there's any questions, I'll be happy to take them. If there's no questions, hopefully this has been useful to you.
All right. Thank you, Roshan. I think there are 2 questions from the questions tab. Maybe I'll read the first one out for you.
Sure.
How do you prevent yourself from burning out in the culture of high performance and productivity?
That's a good question. So I think burning out is a result of you having no passion in a space. So then you have to ask yourself, it's an alignment of your passion with your values and so on and so forth. So if you're in an organization where you don't share the same passion of that organization, then you will burn out, right? And all of us have what we call normal burnout, which is I'm just tired. It's different from burning out, which is I'm really depressed and I'm going into this huge issue, personal issues, right? That one I think is very different from what we call normal tiredness, right? Tiredness, everybody has tiredness. So that one you just need a good night's sleep and you need to take a week off and rest and recuperate. But I think most burnout happens when you are not passionate about the work that you do. So those are questions you have to ask yourself. Remember, again, you can if you go to the handout section, you can I've opened it up. You can download all the slides and you can look at the slides where I asked that self-awareness quiz, right? Where you can ask yourself, am I passionate about the work that we do? And if I'm not passionate about the work, it's likely to drive you to burnout, right? Now, I don't think high performance productivity people burn you out. So I was in a super high performance, high productivity company called GE for many, many years. I don't think I got burnt out in that way. It was fun, exciting. But when you reach a point when you know what really burns you out is when you reach a point where you're not so passionate about what you do anymore. Then you start to say, okay, it's time for me to move on. So I think that the answer is to move on, right? And I think the next question, how do you sustain a high level of motivation at your workplace consistently? I think, again, it goes back to your question on passion, right? So if you can find that alignment between the organization and what you do and what you want to do in life, right? And you have that alignment, right? You will find that energy, because, I was reading my HR person, Swetling, she wrote a post in LinkedIn yesterday or today, I can't remember, but I was reading it today. And she wrote, and she said that, on Sunday, this Sunday, she was so excited about Monday. She said, I usually don't work on Sunday, but but it's so exciting. So I decided to work on Sunday, and she can't wait for Monday, right? So if you read a post, then I'm like, I mean, that to me, it's like when you have the excitement, you can't wait for Monday. Sunday already you want to start working. That one is where you will find the energy, because it's not just about and she writes in her post, right? It's very hard work. The work she's doing now is super hard work because it's a critical time in the company's history, right? But it's so hard and she detests it, but she loves it because it drives her. And even Sunday, I kind of get excited. Friday is very sad because Friday means I don't have to work. I cannot work on Saturday, or unless I have to, right? But Friday is the end of my excitement. Then I have to rest for the weekend. But Sunday is so exciting because tomorrow is Monday, right? I mean, if you have that kind of passion, right, you will be able to sustain yourself, I think. What if the heavy workload and stress from work causes you to lose passion towards something you used to be very passionate about? Is the problem of being not passionate enough? No, I agree. Sometimes it's the workload. And I think this is where you have to start developing yourself. So there's a couple of things that I talked about, right, in my earlier stories, right, is how do you develop a productivity methodology? So sometimes if you look at the workload, right, the workload can be reduced if we are clever and drive productivity hacks. Right? So, sometimes work comes in and I realized that some work doesn't need to be done. I did this in one of my jobs, right? I realized there's so many things, and this was, I can't remember which role it was, one of my earlier days, when I was an analyst. So there was all these different reports that I have to do for this person, and this is traditional. And so one day I decided to try this. For 1 month, I didn't do any reports. I didn't do any reports at all. Wow, I got 7 people scolded me. Hey, you didn't send me this thing. I really need this. Da, 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 da. Now, I used to do about 40 over reports, but there were 7 reports that people got angry that they were not delivered. And so then I quickly did the 7 and I delivered. And I didn't do the remaining 30 something, right? Then I waited and waited. Next month, I did only the 7 on time. Nobody replied for the remaining 30 something. And then they did another 7. Then I realized, hey, I just don't have to do the 30 something. It's not valuable in the organization. And sometimes when so I'm giving this example. And again, Sheena, I'm not sure how it translates in your specific situation. It may be different. But what I realized is that many times we do a lot of work that may not necessarily be useful to the organization. It's just that work that we think is useful. And so we seem like a heavy workload. But when we start to question whether it's useful or not, then we start to realize maybe it's not, and maybe we are just doing it because we like doing it, not necessarily that it's useful. So it's just sometimes things that we can, little hacks that we can play to challenge ourselves. Maybe the heavy workload is sometimes the heavy workload is not because of the company, it's because of ourselves. We enjoy taking on more work because it's exciting. So sometimes it's a personal thing, and then we get so stressed out. And we don't ask for help. Sometimes it's as simple as asking for help. Hey, I'm doing all these things. And because you're valued in the organization, people see that you're doing good work. They will give you another resource. So I had my R&D head who was a person who was doing things on her own. And she came to me one day, she's like, I'm so tired. I'm so many things happening. Then I said, so you need another person. Can I? And I said, yeah, take her. Right? And boom, we gave her a person. And she's like, oh, like that. I mean, yeah, you ask, you get, right? And you are a person we like because you're doing some great work, and continue doing great work. Sure. And then now she's like, can I have one more person? I'm like, okay, great. But I'm going to throw business intelligence to you, and so on and so forth, right? So, but it's a dialogue, right? So sometimes it's something that can be sorted out through dialogue. Sometimes it's delegation. Sometimes it's never a straightforward answer, but I think sometimes we have to ask ourselves first, are we the problem of the heavy workload and stress? So with that, Andrew, I pass back the time to you.
All right. Thank you, Roshan. I think this has been a very useful webinar for our young people here. And that's it for today. So I would just lastly like to thank again Roshan for coming on and speaking to us about adulting and how do we thrive in our careers. And I also like to thank everybody who's here today. Thank you for joining us. We hope that you would share the good news and share that we have a lot of webinars coming up. And I'm going to go quickly play an outro video and show you what we have in the upcoming weeks to come. So hopefully we'll see you next week. And thank you everybody once again.